Think about someone who lied to you. Not once, not twice, systematically, for years. Maybe it was a business partner who kept renegotiating deals after you'd already signed. Maybe it was someone who promised things they never intended to deliver. You remember that moment, right? When you finally realized they were never going to keep their word. And something inside you changed forever. Now multiply that by a nation, by 200 years, by 23 separate treaties, every single one signed under duress. Every single one violated by the other side. That's China's experience with Western promises. Here's what your history classes skipped. Between 1842 and 1949, Western powers forced China to sign treaty after treaty. And here's the pattern. The same pattern exposed over and over. Promise something, breach the terms, demand more, repeat. You've watched China's rise your entire life, from Nixon's handshake to today's superpower standoff. Maybe you've wondered, why won't China just trust the international system? Why do they demand everything in writing with enforcement mechanisms? Why the paranoia? It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start at the beginning, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking. Britain had just won the First Opium War, a war fought, let's be clear, because China tried to stop British merchants from flooding their country with drugs. China lost. And at gunpoint, they signed. The treaty's opening language promised peace and friendship between Britain and China. Those were the actual words. Peace and friendship. That was the contract. Here's what peace and friendship looked like in practice. China surrendered Hong Kong, permanently. China paid 21 million silver dollars, roughly $600 million in today's terms. China opened 5 ports to British trade with no reciprocal access. China gave British citizens immunity from Chinese law on Chinese soil. But here's the clause they don't teach you. The treaty contained what's called the Most Favored Nation provision. Sounds harmless, right? It meant any privilege China granted to any other Western nation automatically extended to Britain, too. Think about what that means legally. China couldn't negotiate separate deals. Every concession to anyone became a concession to everyone. Britain had rigged the contract so China could never play Western powers against each other. And they called this free trade. 14 years later, Britain wanted more. The treaty terms weren't enough. So they found a pretext, the Arrow Incident, a minor dispute over a ship's registration, and launched the Second Opium War. China lost again. The Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 promised an end to hostilities if China opened more ports, allowed foreign diplomats in Beijing, and permitted missionaries throughout the country. China signed. Hostilities ended. Contract executed. Terms agreed. 2 years later, Britain burned the Summer Palace to the ground anyway. Not during the war, after the treaty. Lord Elgin, the British commander, ordered 3,500 troops to spend 3 days systematically destroying one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. 200 buildings, gardens that took 150 years to create, art that can never be recovered. In his own letters, still preserved in British archives, Elgin wrote that he wanted to leave a mark that would be forever visible. He wanted China to remember the cost of resistance. They did. The Convention of Peking followed. More ports, more money, more territory. The pattern established. Promise peace. Violate the terms. Demand renegotiation. Extract more. By the 1890s, Western powers had refined their approach into a system. They didn't need to conquer China. That was expensive and messy. They just needed to extract from it. Britain got the Yangtze Valley. France got the southern provinces. Germany got Shandong. Russia got Manchuria. The Chinese called this carving the melon. Their country sliced up like fruit at a dinner party. And in 1900, when Chinese citizens finally rebelled against foreign domination, 8 nations, Britain, France, America, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, sent 50,000 troops to occupy Beijing. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 demanded 450 million taels in reparations. That's roughly $333 million, over 1,300% of China's annual tax revenue, payable over 39 years, with interest. The protocol also gave foreign powers the right to station troops permanently on Chinese soil, to protect their interests. Imagine that contract. Foreign soldiers permanently stationed in your country because you failed to stop a rebellion against foreign domination. Every treaty, every promise, every violation. Documented, exposed, remembered. World War I ended in 1918. China had joined the Allies. Over 100,000 Chinese laborers served on the Western Front, digging trenches, clearing battlefields, burying the dead. China expected something in return, specifically the return of Shandong Province, which Germany had seized in 1898. The Paris Peace Conference promised a new world order. President Wilson's 14 points guaranteed self-determination, sovereignty, an end to imperial exploitation. That was the stated contract. Here's what China got. Nothing. Worse than nothing. The Treaty of Versailles transferred German holdings in Shandong not back to China, but to Japan. Read that again. China fought on the winning side. China contributed to Allied victory, and the peace conference handed Chinese territory to another foreign power. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a side deal made behind closed doors. Japan had extracted secret agreements from Britain and France during the war. When the war ended, those backroom promises trumped any public commitment to China. May 4th, 1919. Chinese students took to the streets. The May 4th movement, which your history books might mention as an anti-imperialist protest, was specifically a response to broken Western promises at Versailles. The phrase that emerged, "The West cannot be trusted." Now fast forward to 1949. If you grew up during the Cold War, you remember what came next. The Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War. The People's Republic controlled mainland China, 540 million people, the world's largest population. But for 22 years, the United States insisted that China's seat at the United Nations belonged to Taiwan. Taiwan, an island of 8 million people, representing China in the international body that was supposed to represent all nations. American leaders promised that engagement with the free world would bring China into the international community. That was the stated policy. But look at the actual terms: economic embargo, technology restrictions, diplomatic isolation, military encirclement. Pull up a map of American military bases in Asia circa 1960. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand. It's a ring around China. During the Korean War, the United States considered using nuclear weapons against China. That's not speculation. That's declassified U.S. military documents. General MacArthur requested authorization. The promise? Integration into the international system. The reality? Isolation until China's government changed to one America approved of. Same pattern, different century. Promise engagement. Deliver containment. You probably remember Nixon's visit to China in 1972. The handshake with Mao, the historic opening. You might have watched it on TV. What followed was a new era of promises. The Shanghai Communique established a framework. The United States acknowledged one China and that Taiwan was part of China. Both sides agreed to work toward normalization. That was the diplomatic contract. In 1979, the United States formally recognized the People's Republic. Carter promised to end official relations with Taiwan, to withdraw U.S. troops from the island, to terminate the Mutual Defense Treaty. Here's what also happened in 1979. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. Same year. It committed the U.S. to provide Taiwan with defensive weapons. It declared that any attempt to determine Taiwan's future by non-peaceful means would be of grave concern to the United States. One hand signs recognition of one China. The other hand passes legislation committing to Taiwan's defense. Which was the real promise? Which was theater? Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American officials spoke of engagement. Remember the theory? It went like this. Trade with China, integrate them into global markets. Prosperity will create a middle class. The middle class will demand democracy. China will liberalize. This wasn't a secret strategy. American presidents said it openly. Clinton, Bush, they all articulated the same expectation. Economic engagement will change China's political system. December 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. You probably remember the debate. President Clinton had promised that WTO membership would be transformative. By joining the WTO, Clinton said, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The theory again. Trade liberalization leads to political liberalization. Markets open minds. 24 years later, how did that work out? China's economy grew from $1.3 trillion in 2001 to over $17 trillion today. World Bank data, not Chinese government claims, shows they lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They built the world's largest high-speed rail network from zero. They became the world's manufacturing center. And the political system? Still the Communist Party, still authoritarian, still very much not a Western-style democracy. Western economists now say China cheated. They didn't follow the rules. They subsidized industries. They required technology transfers. They didn't liberalize the way they were supposed to. But here's the question nobody asks. Did China ever actually promise to democratize? Go back and read the WTO accession documents. Find where China committed to political reform. It's not there. China promised to lower tariffs, open markets, and follow trade rules. That's what WTO membership requires. That's what the contract specified. The expectation that China would democratize, that was a Western assumption, a hope dressed up as inevitability. When it didn't happen, the West called it betrayal. But China never signed that contract. The West wrote it themselves, and then blamed China for not honoring terms that were never agreed to. Pattern recognition. Promise one thing, expect another. Blame the other party when your unstated expectations aren't met. So here's where we are. Over 200 years, dozens of treaties, a pattern so consistent you could set your watch by it. 1842, promise peace and friendship, violate the terms, demand more territory. 1858, promise end of hostilities, burn the palace anyway. 1901, promise territorial integrity, send troops to occupy the capital. 1919, promise self-determination, give Chinese territory to Japan. 1950 to 1971, promise international integration, enforce 22 years of isolation. 1979, promise one China, pass the Taiwan Relations Act. 2001, promise engagement brings convergence, blame China when it doesn't. See the pattern? This isn't ancient history filed away in archives. Chinese schoolchildren learn these treaties. They visit the ruins of the Summer Palace, kept as ruins deliberately, as a reminder. The phrase, century of humiliation, isn't propaganda. It's curriculum. When Chinese negotiators sit across from Western counterparts today, they're not starting from zero. They're starting from 200 years of documented evidence that Western promises have an expiration date. That's why China demands everything in writing, with enforcement mechanisms, with penalties for non-compliance, with verification protocols. That's not paranoia. That's institutional memory functioning exactly as designed. Western observers sometimes mock China's insistence on win-win language in agreements. But think about it from their perspective. For 200 years, agreements with Western powers meant China lost and the West won. Demanding explicit mutual benefit isn't empty rhetoric. It's a trauma response encoded into policy. Psychologists who study national trauma talk about collective memory, how societies process and transmit historical wounds across generations. China doesn't just remember the century of humiliation. They institutionalized the memory. They built it into their education system, their museums, their diplomatic training. Every Chinese diplomat learns the Unequal Treaties. Every Chinese leader references them. When Xi Jinping talks about national rejuvenation, he's not speaking in abstractions. He's referencing specific wounds, specific broken promises, specific patterns that Western audiences often don't even know exist. And here's what Western policymakers consistently miss. You cannot rebuild trust by making new promises. Not after 200 years of documented violations. The only thing that rebuilds trust is consistent behavior over time. Decades of kept commitments. Generations of honored terms. Words mean nothing. Contracts mean nothing. Only patterns matter. And the pattern, from China's perspective, has been remarkably consistent. You've watched this entire transformation with your own eyes. Nixon's handshake, Tiananmen, Hong Kong's return, the Beijing Olympics, the rise of a superpower. And maybe now you understand something you didn't before. When China refuses to take Western promises at face value, they're not being difficult. They're being rational. When they demand verification mechanisms and enforcement protocols, they're not being paranoid. They're reading their own history. Here's the uncomfortable truth Western leaders won't say publicly. China doesn't believe Western promises because Western promises have been broken. Consistently, systematically, documentably, for 2 centuries. The evidence isn't Chinese propaganda. It's in British archives, American congressional records, the Treaty of Versailles, the ruins of the Summer Palace. After 200 years of documented broken contracts, China's insistence on written guarantees with enforcement mechanisms makes perfect sense. When you understand the pattern, you understand the policy. That's not paranoia, that's pattern recognition. The question isn't why China doesn't trust Western promises. The question is, why would they?